The needle pierced through fabric as Zelda Nichols sat hunched over her quilting frame in the dim lamplight of her small cabin outside Fairplay, Colorado. Her fingers moving with desperate precision, because every stitch meant another penny toward survival in this unforgiving territory of 1876. She had been widowed 3 years now, and the memory of James still haunted the corners of this rough-hewn room where they had planned to raise a family, where they had laughed about the future, where he had kissed her goodbye before riding out to work the silver mines that day he never returned. The cave-in had taken 6 men, including her husband, and left her with nothing but debts and a property that barely qualified as farmland. At 23 years old, she had become one of those women the town whispered about, the young widow struggling alone, too proud to remarry out of desperation, too stubborn to leave the only home she had known since traveling west from Pennsylvania. Her quilts had become her salvation and her sentence. Each one took weeks to complete, piecing together scraps of fabric she collected from the general store, from neighbors, from her own worn dresses that had seen better days. She sold them for whatever coin she could get, usually to miners' wives or the occasional traveler passing through Fairplay on their way to somewhere better. The money barely covered flour, beans, and the feed for her 2 chickens, but it kept her independent, kept her from having to accept charity or worse. One of the proposals from men who saw a young widow as an easy solution to their need for a cook and bed warmer. The quilt beneath her hands was her finest work yet, a pattern of interlocking stars in blues and golds that reminded her of the Colorado sky at twilight. She had been working on it for nearly a month, her eyes straining in the poor light, her fingers sometimes bleeding from where the needle slipped. But it would fetch a good price, she told herself. Maybe $5 if she was lucky. $5 could mean meat for a week, or new thread for the next project, or a small payment toward the property taxes that loomed over her like a thundercloud. A knock at her door startled her so badly she pricked her finger, a drop of blood welling up bright red against her pale skin. Visitors were rare, especially after dark, and her heart hammered with a mixture of fear and caution as she set aside her work and moved toward the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Name is Mason Jameson, madam. I am from the Triple J Ranch about 5 miles north of here. I am not here to cause trouble." Zelda recognized the name. Everyone in Fairplay knew about the Triple J, one of the largest cattle operations in this part of Colorado. She had never met the owner personally, but she had heard talk. He was a man who had built his spread from nothing, who drove his cattle to market himself, who paid fair wages and did not tolerate nonsense from his hands. He was also, according to the gossip that circulated through the general store, unmarried and somewhere in his late 20s, which made him a subject of considerable speculation among the unmarried women in town. She opened the door a crack, keeping her body behind it, and found herself looking at a man who matched his reputation for plain-spoken competence. He was tall, probably just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that came from years of hard work rather than natural bulk. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned, though he was not smiling now. His dark hair needed cutting, curling slightly at his collar, and his eyes were an unexpected gray-green that caught the lamplight from her cabin. "Miss Nichols," he said, removing his hat. "I apologize for calling so late. I was in town and Martha Henderson at the general store mentioned you might have quilts for sale. I am looking to purchase several if you have them available." Zelda's surprise must have shown on her face because he continued quickly. "I know it is an unusual request from a rancher, but I have need of them." May I come in to discuss business, or would you prefer to meet in town tomorrow? I understand if you are uncomfortable with a stranger at your door after dark. His courtesy decided her. A man with ill intentions rarely offered to leave and return at a more proper time. She opened the door wider, though she kept her hand on the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. I have 4 completed quilts and 1 nearly finished, she said, gesturing to the stack in the corner where she kept her inventory. They range from $3 to $5 depending on size and complexity of pattern. Mason stepped inside, ducking slightly to clear the low door frame, and his presence immediately made her small cabin feel even smaller. He moved to the stack of quilts and began examining them with an attention to detail that surprised her. He was not just being polite or going through motions. He actually looked at the stitching, ran his hands over the patterns, held them up to see how they caught the light. "These are exceptional quality," he said, and there was genuine appreciation in his voice. "I will take all 4 of the completed ones and I will pay you $6 each for them." Zelda felt her breath catch. $6 was more than she had ever received for a quilt, and for him to take all 4 at once meant $24. That was more money than she usually saw in 3 months of work. "That is very generous," she said carefully, "but the prices I quoted are fair." "I do not need charity." His eyes met hers then, and she saw something shift in his expression. Respect, maybe, or understanding. "It is not charity, Miss Nichols. It is honest pay for honest work. These quilts are worth $6 by any measure, and I am willing to pay what they are worth." "Will you accept my offer?" Pride warred with necessity in her chest, but necessity won as it always did. "Yes," she said quietly. "Thank you." He pulled out a leather wallet and counted out the bills with precise movements. When he handed her the money, their fingers brushed briefly, and Zelda felt an unexpected jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the transaction they were conducting. "Would you be willing to make more?" he asked as he gathered the quilts. "I find I have need of several more, and I would prefer to purchase from you if you are willing to take commissions." "How many more?" she asked, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. "6 to start," he said. "Perhaps more after that. I can pay half now and half upon delivery if that suits you." Her mind raced through the calculations. 6 quilts at $6 each was $36 more. With what he had just paid her, she would have enough to settle her property taxes, buy supplies to last through winter, and still have a small cushion against disaster. It seemed too good to be true, which made her suspicious. "Why do you need so many quilts, Mr. Jameson?" "That is a lot for one man, even one with a large ranch house." He paused in the doorway, the stack of quilts in his arms, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I have 15 men working for me, Miss Nichols. Most of them sleep in the bunkhouse with nothing but thin wool blankets that barely keep the cold out. Winter is coming, and I would like them to have something warmer. These quilts will do nicely." The simple decency of it struck her silent. She had heard of employers who barely provided for their workers, who saw them as interchangeable parts of the ranch operation. But here was a man willing to pay good money to ensure his men slept warm through the Colorado winter. "That is very kind of you," she said finally. "It is practical," he corrected, but there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Men work better when they are not freezing at night. I will return in 2 weeks to see how you are progressing with the new quilts. Good evening, Miss Nichols." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing in her doorway with $24 in her hand and a strange feeling of anticipation that had nothing to do with the money. Over the next 2 weeks, Zelda worked harder than she ever had. She rose before dawn and sewed by lamplight long after dark, her fingers flying through the familiar motions, her mind wandering in directions she tried to discipline. She kept thinking about Mason Jameson, about the way he had examined her quilts with such care, about how he had offered fair pay without condescension, about his quiet statement that it was for his men's comfort. In a territory where kindness was often seen as weakness, such consideration stood out like a beacon. She made trips to town for supplies, and on her second visit, Martha Henderson at the general store had plenty to say about her mysterious customer. "Mason Jameson is one of the good ones," Martha said as she cut fabric for Zelda's purchases. "Came out here 7 years ago with nothing but a horse and determination. Worked as a hand on other ranches, saved every penny and bought that land when old Jacobson passed. Built it up from 100 head of cattle to over 500 now. He is fair with his men, honest in his dealings, and he does not drink away his profits like some." She gave Zelda a meaningful look. "He is also unmarried, in case you were wondering." "I was not wondering," Zelda said firmly, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Of course not," Martha said with a knowing smile. "Still, it is interesting that he came looking for you specifically. He could have ordered blankets from any supplier, but he wanted your quilts." Zelda tried to dismiss the comment, but it stayed with her as she worked. Was there more to his visit than just a business transaction? Or was she reading significance into simple commerce because she was lonely, because her cabin felt emptier than usual after he had filled it with his presence for those few minutes? She told herself it did not matter. She was making good money, honest money, and that was enough. She did not need to spin romantic notions about a rancher who was simply taking care of his employees. But when Mason returned exactly 2 weeks later, this time in the afternoon with the sun bright overhead, she found herself putting on her better dress, the dark green calico that James had always said brought out the color in her eyes. She told herself it was simple courtesy to dress properly for a business meeting. He brought his wagon this time, and when she invited him in, he surveyed the 3 completed quilts she had ready with the same careful attention as before. "You work fast," he said appreciatively. "These are beautiful, Miss Nichols. The men are going to be very grateful." "How are they working out?" she asked. "The first ones you purchased." "Extremely well. I gave one to each of my senior hands, and I have never seen grown men so pleased. My foreman, Dutch, actually got misty-eyed over his. He said it was the first new bedding he had had in 15 years. The image made her smile, a real genuine smile that felt strange on her face after so long. Mason noticed, and his own expression softened. "You should smile more often," he said, then looked startled as if he had not meant to speak the thought aloud. "I apologize. That was forward of me." "No need to apologize for kindness," Zelda said, echoing his own logic from their first meeting. He paid her for the 3 completed quilts and gave her the advance for 3 more, and as he loaded them into his wagon, he hesitated before climbing up to the seat. "Miss Nichols, I wonder if you would allow me to call on you sometime. Not for business, but socially. I would like to get to know you better, if that would be acceptable." Her heart did a complicated dance in her chest. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, drawn to this quiet man with his steady hands and considerate heart. But another part, the part still grieving James, still protective of the independence she had fought so hard to maintain, held back. "I do not know if that would be wise," she said carefully. "People talk in a town like Fairplay, a young widow and a successful rancher. There would be speculation." "Let them speculate," he said. "I am not asking for anything improper, Miss Nichols. Just an hour of your time over coffee, maybe a walk if the weather is fine. I will not press you for more than you are willing to give, and I will not take offense if you decide you want nothing beyond our business arrangement. but I would like the chance to know you better. You strike me as a remarkable woman." The sincerity in his voice undid her resistance. When was the last time someone had called her remarkable? When had anyone looked at her and seen more than the poor widow scraping by on quilt sales? "You may call on me this Sunday afternoon if you like," she heard herself say. "I usually have time free then." The smile that broke across his face transformed him from handsome to something close to beautiful. And Zelda felt her own heart respond with a flutter of anticipation she had thought long dead. Sunday came bright and cool, the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides around Fairplay. Zelda spent the morning in a state of nervous preparation, cleaning her already clean cabin, baking bread she could not really afford, changing her dress 3 times before settling on the green calico again. She felt foolish and young and alive in a way she had not felt since before James died. When Mason arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, he brought wildflowers he must have picked from the high meadows, their colors bright against his work-roughened hands. The gesture touched her more than expensive store-bought flowers ever could have. They sat at her small table with coffee and bread, and the conversation flowed easier than she had expected. He told her about his ranch, about the challenges of running cattle in Colorado's unpredictable weather, about his plans to expand and improve. She told him about her life before becoming a widow, about growing up in Pennsylvania, about the journey west with James, and their dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines. "I am sorry for your loss," Mason said when she fell silent, remembering. "It must have been tremendously difficult." "The worst part was not his death," she said, surprising herself with the honesty. "It was everything after. The pity, the assumptions that I would just fold up or remarry the first man who offered. I needed to prove I could survive on my own terms." "And you have," he said. "That takes real strength, or stubbornness," she said with a small laugh. "Sometimes those are the same thing." He paused, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I understand about needing to prove yourself. When I first came to Colorado, people took one look at me and saw just another drifter who would be gone by winter. It made me work twice as hard to show them they were wrong. But there is a difference between proving something to others and punishing yourself out of pride." His words struck closer to home than she wanted to admit. Was that what she had been doing? Punishing herself by refusing any help, by working herself to exhaustion, by denying herself any comfort or companionship. "I am not punishing myself," she said, but the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "Are you not?" he asked gently. "When was the last time you did something just because it brought you joy, not because it was practical or necessary, but simply because it made you happy?" She could not answer because she could not remember. Her life had become nothing but necessity, every action calculated for survival, every decision weighed against the cost. Joy had become a luxury she could not afford. The silence stretched between them until Mason said quietly, "I would like to help you find joy again, Zelda, if you will let me." The use of her first name created an intimacy that both frightened and thrilled her. She looked at him across her small table, this man who had walked into her life 2 weeks ago and somehow seen past the capable widow to the lonely woman beneath. "I do not know if I remember how," she admitted. "Then we will figure it out together," he said, and reached across the table to take her hand. His hand was warm and calloused and solid, and Zelda felt something inside her chest crack open, letting in a little bit of light. Over the following weeks, Mason became a regular presence in her life. He came to collect the quilts as she finished them, but he always stayed longer than necessary, always found excuses to linger over coffee, to help her with small repairs around her cabin, to just talk. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel pressured or obligated. He simply showed up, steady and patient, like the mountains that surrounded them. He brought her things that made her protests die on her lips because they were so clearly thoughtful rather than pitying. A better lamp when he noticed her straining her eyes in the poor light. A basket of vegetables from his ranch garden that he claimed was surplus. A book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. "You are courting me," she said one afternoon when he arrived with a jar of honey from his beehives. "Yes," he said simply. "Is that all right?" She wanted to say no, wanted to maintain her careful independence, wanted to protect herself from the vulnerability of caring for someone who might be taken from her. But she found herself saying, "Yes, it is all right." The smile he gave her made her feel like she had given him something precious. As autumn deepened into early winter, their relationship deepened as well. Mason told her about his past, about growing up in Missouri, about losing his own parents to cholera, about coming west to escape memories and build something new. She understood that drive, that need to create a future from the wreckage of the past. She told him things she had never told anyone, about her guilt that she felt relief sometimes along with the grief, about her fear that she was not strong enough to make it alone, about her dreams she had given up on having children and a real home. "You are the strongest person I know," Mason said fiercely, "and you do not have to be alone unless you choose to be." One evening in November, after she had delivered the last of the commissioned quilts to his ranch and had seen the genuine pleasure on his men's faces when they received them, Mason asked if he could show her something. He drove her in his wagon to a rise overlooking his property, where the land spread out in rolling hills dotted with cattle, the ranch house and buildings solid and well kept in the valley below. "I built all of this from nothing," he said. "But it is just property, just cattle and buildings. It does not mean anything without someone to share it with." He turned to face her, and in the fading light his eyes were serious. "I am in love with you, Zelda. I think I have been since the first time I saw you with your quilts, so proud and stubborn and beautiful. I know it has not been long, and I know you might not feel the same way yet, but I wanted you to know. I do not expect an answer right now. I just needed you to know how I feel." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She looked at this man who had been so patient, so kind, so steady, and realized with a shock that she loved him too. Somewhere in the past 2 months, between quilts and coffee and quiet conversations, she had fallen in love with Mason Jameson. "I am afraid," she whispered. "I am afraid of losing someone again, of letting myself be happy only to have it torn away." "I know," he said, and pulled her close. "I am afraid too, but I would rather have whatever time we get together than spend my life safe and alone. Life does not come with guarantees, Zelda. All we can do is choose to be brave." She looked up at him, at the face that had become so dear to her, and made her choice. "I love you too," she said, and felt the truth of it ring through her bones. He kissed her then, soft and careful and full of promise, and Zelda felt the last walls around her heart crumble away. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Fairplay, with Martha Henderson and Mason's foreman Dutch standing as witnesses. Zelda wore her mother's lace, packed away since her journey west, and carried wildflowers even though it was December. And Mason had to ride to 3 different valleys to find them still blooming in protected spots. When he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and when she said hers, she meant every word with her whole heart. The ranch hands had decorated the ranch house with pine boughs and candles, and someone had attempted to bake a cake that was lopsided but tasted wonderful. Dutch made a toast that had everyone laughing and a few people crying, and the celebration went on until the snow started falling, soft and quiet in the darkness. Mason carried her over the threshold of the house he had built with his own hands, and as Zelda looked around at the solid walls, the good furniture, the stone fireplace big enough to stand in, she felt a sense of homecoming she had not experienced since before James died. But this was different. This was not a cabin they were going to fix up someday, not a dream deferred by hard luck. This was real and present and theirs. "Welcome home," Mason said, setting her down gently, and Zelda felt tears sting her eyes because she was home, truly home for the first time in years. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of discovery and gentle laughter when awkwardness intruded. Mason was patient and careful, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when Zelda finally fell asleep in his arms, she slept better than she had in 3 years. In the morning, she woke to find Mason already up, building up the fire to warm the bedroom. When he saw she was awake, he brought her coffee in bed, a luxury she had never experienced. "You do not have to serve me," she protested, though she took the cup gratefully. "I know," he said. "I want to." "There is a difference." He sat on the edge of the bed, his own cup warming his hands. "I have been thinking about your quilts." "Oh." She was not sure where this was going. "You are incredibly talented, Zelda. Those quilts you made were some of the finest craftsmanship I have ever seen. I was thinking you might want to continue, not because you have to, but because you enjoy it. We could set up a proper sewing room for you, with good light and all the supplies you need. You could sell them through Martha's store, build a reputation. It could be yours, something that belongs just to you." She stared at him, this man who kept surprising her with his understanding. Many husbands would have expected their wives to set aside their own work to focus solely on home and family. But Mason was offering her the means to continue her craft, to maintain that independence she had fought so hard for. "You would not mind?" she asked. "Why would I mind? You have a gift, and gifts should not be wasted. Besides, I am not looking for a servant, Zelda. I am looking for a partner. That means you get to keep being yourself." She set down her coffee cup and kissed him, trying to pour into that kiss all the gratitude and love she felt. The winter passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Zelda learned the rhythms of the ranch, met all of Mason's men properly, and found herself welcomed warmly by everyone. The quilts she had made for them had earned her their respect and affection, and she was treated as the lady of the house rather than just the boss's wife. She set up her sewing room in the spare bedroom that got the best light, and Mason was true to his word, buying her fabric and thread and a proper quilting frame. She made quilts when the mood struck her, but she also explored other parts of her new life. She learned to ride well enough to go with Mason when he checked on the cattle. She practiced her cooking, which had been basic survival before and now became an opportunity to create meals that brought pleasure rather than just sustenance. She read by the fire in the evenings while Mason worked on his accounts, their comfortable silence a testament to their growing intimacy. By February, she knew she was pregnant. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had wanted children with James, had mourned that lost possibility along with mourning him. But now, carrying Mason's child, she found herself overwhelmed with hope and fear. She told him one evening after dinner, just blurted it out with none of the grace she had planned. "I am going to have a baby." Mason's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, joy, wonder, and finally a grin so wide it looked like it might split his face. "Are you certain?" "Very certain," she said. And then she was in his arms, and he was spinning her around despite her protests, and they were both laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to have a child," he said wonderingly, his hand settling gently on her stomach that showed no sign yet of the life within. "A son or daughter, our family." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear it. Happy does not begin to cover it, he said. Zelda, you have given me everything I never knew I needed. And now this. I do not have words for what I am feeling right now. The pregnancy was not easy. Zelda was sick for the first few months, and Mason worried over her like a mother hen, bringing her weak tea and crackers, holding her hair when she was ill, sleeping on the floor beside the bed when she could not get comfortable. His devotion during those difficult months only deepened her love for him. As spring came and her sickness eased, she bloomed. Her figure rounded with the growing child, and Mason seemed fascinated by every change, talking to her belly in the evenings, his hand always finding its way to feel for kicks and movements. "What do you hope for?" she asked him one night as they lay in bed, his hand spread across her stomach. "A boy or a girl, healthy," he said immediately. "I do not care beyond that, though if we have a daughter, I hope she has your eyes and your strength, and if we have a son, I hope he has your kindness and your determination." "What about your traits?" she teased. "He or she will get those anyway," he said with mock seriousness. "I am just hoping the good parts of you overwhelm any unfortunate characteristics I might pass along." She swatted his shoulder gently, and he caught her hand and kissed it. The baby came in late September, after a labor that lasted from sunrise to sunset, and left Zelda exhausted and sweat-soaked and more in love with her husband than ever because he had stayed with her through it all. Despite the scandalized protests of the doctor they had brought from Fairplay. Mason had held her hand, wiped her face, whispered encouragement when she thought she could not go on, and was the first to hold their son when he finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect. "A son," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the baby in Zelda's arms. "We have a son." She looked down at the tiny face, the dark hair plastered to his scalp, the miniature hands waving in the air, and felt love crash over her like a physical force. This was her child, hers and Mason's, a new life created from their love. "What should we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on anything, both of them wanting to see the baby first. Now, looking at their son, Mason said quietly, "What about James for your first husband? He was part of your journey to me. I would like to honor that." Fresh tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "James Mason Jameson," she said. "It is perfect." Their son was a good baby, healthy and strong, with Mason's gray-green eyes and Zelda's determined chin. Mason was a devoted father, changing nappies without complaint, walking the floor with James when he fussed, singing off key lullabies that made Zelda smile in the darkness. Watching him with their son, Zelda sometimes thought about the journey that had brought her here. If someone had told her 5 years ago that she would lose one husband and find another, that she would build a life from grief and determination, that she would end up happier than she had ever imagined possible, she would not have believed them. But life, she was learning, had a way of surprising you when you were brave enough to stay open to possibility. As James grew from infant to toddler, Zelda returned to her quilting with renewed passion. Her work became known throughout the region, and people came from as far as Denver to purchase her quilts. She developed a reputation for quality and artistry, and her quilts commanded prices that would have seemed impossible back in her widow's cabin. But she never forgot where she had come from. When she heard of another widow struggling to make ends meet, she bought supplies in bulk and sold them at cost to the woman, showing her patterns and techniques. When the church needed funds to help families in need, she donated quilts for their charity auction. Her success became a way to lift others as she had been lifted. Mason expanded the ranch, hiring more men, increasing his herd, building new structures. But he always made time for his family, riding in for lunch when he could. teaching James to ride almost before the boy could walk, including Zelda in decisions about the ranch's future. 2 years after James was born, they had a daughter they named Mary, with Zelda's dark hair and Mason's smile. James was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Mason joked that they already had a built-in ranch hand in training. Their life was not perfect. There were hard times when the cattle market dropped, when drought threatened their water supply, when illness swept through the bunkhouse and left everyone worried. But they faced each challenge together, Mason and Zelda united in their determination to protect what they had built. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Mason took Zelda back to the rise where he had first told her he loved her. The children were with Dutch and his wife for the evening, and they had the sunset to themselves. "You remember standing here that day?" Mason asked, his arm around her waist. "How could I forget? You told me you loved me and scared me half to death." "Did I?" He sounded amused. "Terrified me," she confirmed. "I thought I was done with love, done with risking my heart. And then there you were, offering me everything I thought I had lost forever." "I am glad you were brave enough to take the risk," he said softly. "So am I." She leaned against him, solid and warm, and looked out over the ranch that had become her home. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" "That first night you came to my cabin, looking for quilts. What if I had turned you away? What if I had been too proud or too scared to let you in?" "But you did not," he said. "You opened the door and you kept opening it little by little until I could walk fully into your life. That took courage, Zelda. More courage than I think you give yourself credit for." "I had good motivation," she said, turning to face him. "You made it easy to be brave. You were patient when I needed patience, pushy when I needed pushing, and you never once made me feel like I was less than your equal. You gave me back my life, Mason." "No," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "You gave yourself your life back. You were surviving before I met you, making it on your own terms. All I did was ask if you wanted company for the journey." She kissed him then, deep and long, and when they finally broke apart, she said, "Best decision I ever made, saying yes to that company." They stood together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, and Zelda thought about all the threads that had woven together to bring them to this moment. Loss and grief, determination and courage, quilts and coffee and quiet conversations. Every stitch of her life had led her here, to this man, this place, this moment of perfect contentment. Life continued its pattern of challenges and joys. James grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and the cattle, who followed his father everywhere and hung on his every word. Mary was more adventurous, always getting into things she should not, keeping Zelda on her toes. Mason's hair started showing silver at the temples, and Zelda found laugh lines settling permanently around her eyes. 3 years after Mary was born, they had another son, Thomas, who had Mason's temperament and Zelda's artistic eye. He spent more time helping his mother with color selection for her quilts than learning to rope cattle, and Mason defended his son's interests against anyone who suggested the boy should be more rough and tumble. "Let him be who he is," Mason said firmly, when one of the ranch hands made a comment. "The world has enough cowboys. Maybe it needs more artists." Zelda overheard the exchange and loved him even more for it, if that was possible. The years blurred together in the way of happy times, marked by birthdays and holidays, by successful cattle drives and beautiful quilts, by children growing and love deepening. Zelda never stopped making quilts, never lost her reputation for quality, but the desperate edge was gone from the work. Now she sewed because she loved it, because it brought her joy, because it connected her to something essential in herself. She sometimes thought about her younger self, hunched over her quilting frame in that cold cabin, stitching by lamplight with bleeding fingers, and she wanted to reach back through time and tell that woman that it would be all right. That happiness was coming. That opening her door to a stranger with kind eyes would change everything. But she could not, so instead she lived her gratitude every day. She told Mason she loved him, regularly and often. She held her children close and told them they were treasured. She gave generously to others who struggled as she once had. She lived deliberately, mindfully, refusing to take for granted the abundance she had been given. On quiet evenings, when the children were in bed and the ranch was peaceful, she and Mason would sit on their porch and watch the stars come out over the mountains. They did not always talk during those times. Sometimes they just sat, hands linked, content in each other's presence. "You ever miss it?" Mason asked one such evening. "Being on your own, not having to answer to anyone." Zelda considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," she admitted. "When it was just me and my needle and thread, and the only person I had to take care of was myself. But I do not miss the loneliness. I do not miss the fear of whether I would make it through another winter, and I certainly do not miss sleeping alone." She felt him smile in the darkness. "Good, because I have gotten very used to you being there." "Just used to me," she teased. "Utterly dependent on you," he corrected. "Hopelessly addicted to your presence, completely unable to imagine life without you." "That is better," she said with satisfaction. He pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence until the cold drove them inside to their warm bed and warmer embrace. As their children grew toward adulthood, Zelda and Mason talked about the future. James, now 15, was ready to take on more responsibility with the ranch. Mary, 13, had announced her intention to become a teacher. Thomas, at 10, was still finding his way but showed a remarkable talent for drawing that Zelda encouraged. "We did something right," Mason said one day, watching James work with the cattle with the confidence of someone twice his age. "Look at them. They are good people, all three of them." "They had a good example," Zelda said, squeezing his hand. "They had two," he corrected. "You have taught them that work has dignity, that independence matters, that kindness is strength. Those lessons came from you, Zelda." She thought about that, about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The widow sewing quilts for coins had learned that she was worth more than survival, that she deserved love and joy and partnership. And in learning that lesson, she had taught it to her children. The years continued to pass, and Zelda's quilts became treasured heirlooms, passed down through families, displayed in homes throughout Colorado. She had apprenticed several younger women, teaching them her techniques, helping them establish their own businesses. Her legacy was not just in the quilts she made, but in the lives she touched. When James married at 20, his bride received a quilt Zelda had made specially for her. A complex pattern of interlocking rings representing the union of two lives. The girl wept when she saw it, understanding the love and work that had gone into its creation. Mason, now in his 50s, had silver threading his dark hair, but he was still strong and vital, still running the ranch with the same attention to detail and care for his men that had impressed Zelda from the beginning. He had become respected throughout the territory, known for his fair dealing and his innovative ranching methods, but his greatest pride was always his family. He doted on Zelda, still bringing her coffee in bed after all these years, still telling her she was beautiful, still looking at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Because she was, he told anyone who would listen. She had saved him from a life of work without purpose, success without meaning. She had given him love and family and a reason to build something that would outlast them both. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that brought together everyone who had been part of their story. Martha Henderson, now elderly but still sharp, told embarrassing stories about Mason's courtship. Dutch, retired but healthy, raised a glass to the best boss and the finest lady he had ever known. Friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate a marriage that had become legendary in its own way, not for drama or excitement, but for steady, enduring love. In her speech, Mary said, "My parents taught us that love is not just a feeling. It is a choice you make every day. It is showing up even when things are hard. It is being kind even when you are tired. It is building something together that is stronger than either of you could build alone." They have lived that lesson in front of us every day of our lives, and it is the greatest gift they could have given us. Zelda cried, and Mason held her hand, and they both marveled at the life they had created from that first unlikely meeting over quilts and coins. Years later, when they were both old and silver-haired but still very much in love, Zelda and Mason would sit on their porch and tell their grandchildren stories about the old days. The children loved the story of how they met, how Grandpa had come looking for quilts and found love instead. "Did you know right away?" the children would ask. "Did you know Grandma was the one?" "I knew there was something special about her," Mason would say. "The way she looked at me, so proud and independent, the way she stood in that little cabin like she was defending a castle. I knew I wanted to know her better, and the more I knew, the more I wanted to know." "What about you, Grandma?" they would press. "When did you know?" Zelda would think back to those early days, to the fear and hope that had warred in her heart. "I think I knew the first time he made me laugh," she would say. "Your grandfather has a terrible sense of humor, but he made me remember that life could include joy as well as work. And once I remembered that, I could not imagine going back to a life without him in it." The children would sigh, satisfied with the romance of it all, and Zelda and Mason would share a smile over their heads, remembering the reality that had been both harder and sweeter than any story could capture. In the quiet of their old age, when the ranch was being run by James and his sons, when the house was full of children and grandchildren, Zelda sometimes took out those first quilts she had made in her widow's cabin. The stitches were still good, the patterns still beautiful, but she could see in them the desperation that had driven each stitch. She thought about that woman she had been, alone and afraid but determined to survive on her own terms. She was proud of that woman, grateful for her strength and stubbornness. But she was also glad she had learned that strength did not mean refusing help, that independence did not require loneliness. The best thing she had ever done, she thought, was open her door to a rancher looking for quilts. In doing so, she had opened her heart to love again, had found a partner who valued her for exactly who she was, had built a life rich in meaning and connection. Mason found her in their bedroom one afternoon, the old quilt spread around her, and sat down beside her on the bed they had shared for more than 40 years. "Taking a trip down memory lane?" he asked gently. "Something like that," she said, running her hand over the star pattern she had been working on the night he first knocked on her door. "I was thinking about how different my life could have been. If you had not come that night, if I had turned you away, if I had been too scared to take a chance." "But you did not," he said, taking her hand. His grip was not as strong as it once was, his hands marked by age and work, but his touch still made her feel safe. "You opened the door. You took the chance. You were brave, Zelda. You have always been brave." "I had good reason to be brave," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The reward was worth the risk." They sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by quilts that represented not just work but survival, not just artistry but determination. Those quilts had brought them together, had been the excuse and the reason for a rancher to seek out a widow, for two lonely people to find each other in the vast territory of Colorado. As the sun set outside their window, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and rose, Zelda thought about the pattern of her life. Like a quilt, it was made up of many pieces, some light and some dark, some beautiful and some plain. Loss and love, grief and joy, loneliness and connection. Each piece was necessary, each one contributing to the whole, and the whole was beautiful. She had been a girl who came west with dreams, a young wife who lost everything, a widow who fought to survive, a woman who found love when she stopped looking for it. She had been poor and desperate, and she had been wealthy and secure. She had sewn quilts for coins because she had no choice, and she had sewn quilts for joy because she had every choice. But through it all, the constant thread was her own determination to live authentically, to refuse to be defined by circumstances, to keep creating beauty even in difficult times. That thread had led her to Mason, had made her worthy of the love he offered, had helped her build a life that mattered. Years later, when Zelda passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, Mason held her funeral in the church in Fairplay where they had married. The building was packed with people whose lives she had touched, with women she had taught to quilt, with families who cherished the quilts she had made, with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who loved her. Her quilts were displayed throughout the church, a testament to her artistry and her legacy. But the greatest testament was in the faces of her family, in James, who had his mother's determination, in Mary, who had her mother's kindness, in Thomas, who had her mother's artistic soul, and in Mason, who had been blessed with 45 years of marriage to a remarkable woman. At the reception after the funeral, people shared stories of Zelda. How she had helped this family through hard times, how she had taught that girl to sew, how she had always had time to listen, how her quilts kept them warm through countless winters. But the story that was told most often was the one Mason told, sitting surrounded by his grandchildren in the house he and Zelda had filled with love. "Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever knew," he said. "When I met her, she was alone and struggling, but she never gave up. She supported herself with her own hands, creating beauty from scraps. I came looking for quilts to keep my men warm, but I found something far more valuable. I found a woman who taught me that real strength includes vulnerability, that real independence allows for partnership, that real love requires courage." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "She opened her door to me when she could have turned me away. She took a chance on love when she had every reason to be afraid, and in doing so, she gave me the greatest gift of my life. She gave me her heart, and she let me give her mine. Everything good in my life came from that first meeting when a rancher purchased quilts and found love instead." Mason lived another 5 years after Zelda's death, running the ranch with James, playing with his great-grandchildren, always keeping Zelda's sewing room exactly as she had left it. When his time came, he was laid to rest beside her in the Fairplay Cemetery, their headstones simple and unpretentious, marked with their names and the dates of their lives. But their real memorial was in the quilts that still warmed families throughout Colorado, in the children and grandchildren who carried on their values, in the love story that became part of local legend. The widow who sewed quilts for coins, and the rancher who purchased them all, and her affection, too, became a story told to children. A reminder that love can come when you least expect it, that opening your heart requires courage, that the greatest treasures are often found in the most unlikely places. And in homes throughout the territory, in trunks and hope chests and displayed on beds, Zelda's quilts remained, each stitch a testament to the strength of a woman who refused to give up, each pattern a reminder that beauty can be created even in hardship, each quilt a symbol of love that began with a simple transaction and became a lifetime of devotion. The story of Zelda and Mason became one of those tales that took on a life of its own, told and retold, embellished, but never losing its essential truth. That sometimes love comes not with thunder and lightning but with quiet persistence. That the bravest thing we can do is open ourselves to connection after loss. That work done with pride and skill has value beyond its price. That a rancher looking for quilts and a widow selling them for survival could find in each other something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. And in the end, that was the real pattern of their lives, interlocking and complementary, two separate pieces that came together to create something far more beautiful than either could have made alone. A quilt of love, stitched with patience and care, meant to warm not just bodies but hearts, lasting far beyond the lives of its makers, treasured not for its utility, but for the love it represented. That was the legacy of Zelda Nichols Jameson, who sewed quilts for coins and found love, who opened her door to a stranger and found her destiny, who took the scraps of her broken life and created something beautiful. And of Mason Jameson, who came looking for quilts and found the woman who completed him, who was patient enough to wait for love and wise enough to recognize it when it appeared. Their story ended not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived together, a love well nurtured, a family well raised. And really, what more could anyone ask for than that?